are in chapter 16 of Luke's Gospel, and chapter 15 and 16 are full with parables. Last week we had this parable set alongside, our parable for today set alongside last week's parable, which was the parable of the dishonest manager. If you were here, you remember how troubling that parable is in one way because it's so difficult to understand. It sort of defies definition. Even some of the interpretations that Luke gives afterwards are somewhat defying of the parable itself. And today's parable is no less troubling, but compared to that parable last week that defied definition, this one is troubling in its clarity. It's abundantly clear what it's trying to get at. A rich man lived in luxury, and Lazarus lived in poverty at the rich man's doorstep. Both men died, they both went to Hades, and they both experienced a great reversal of their fortunes. The rich man found himself living in torment, but Lazarus, the former beggar, ended up living in great comfort. Just as Lazarus had hoped that he would receive scraps that had fallen from the rich man's table, now, in a reversal, the rich man himself hopes that he might receive a drop of water from the finger of Lazarus to cool his burning tongue. Now, one thing to be very clear about is that Jesus is not talking here about heaven and hell. He's talking about Hades. The understanding of the Hebrew would be Sheol, the place of the dead. We're not talking about the place of final judgment or the place where we finally end up. In early Jewish thought, Hades or Sheol was a gloomy pit where souls live sort of a shadowy experience after their lives. Then they began to believe in the resurrection, and they thought of Sheol or Hades as a place where the dead awaited resurrection, sort of like a great big doctor's waiting room, if you will, or limbo. It feels the same way if you're in a doctor's waiting room. Gradually, they began to believe after a period of time that in the resurrection that the wicked would be separated out from the righteous, and that would even begin in Sheol. And that's what Jesus is picturing here. But it's clear, you have to be clear that we're not talking about heaven and hell yet. We're not talking about final destinations. We're talking about a waiting place, which I think makes the realities of what these two people experience poignant. For Lazarus, the beggar, Hades is paradise compared to where he had been in living his earthly life. Where for the man who feasted sumptuously and lived in luxury, it was torment, misery, hopelessness. It's interesting to me to look at this rich man. What did he do wrong? Why is he being punished? He didn't do anything terrible to Lazarus in his life. He never, as far as the parable tells us, he never drove Lazarus from his doorstep. He never said, "Get on out of here." He doesn't say to the rich man it doesn't say that the rich man even denied him any scraps from his table. He didn't seem to throw a fuss about him going through his garbage can. There was nothing that seemed to be adversarial about their relationship. It doesn't suggest that he was abusive toward Lazarus either. Why then is the rich man being punished? What was so terrible about this guy who's described simply as being rich? I think that's an important question for us, isn't it? Some of us think of ourselves as poor. Most of us like to think of ourselves as middle class. Very few of us probably consider ourselves rich, but let's look at what made the rich man rich today. He dressed in fine clothing. Purple, it said. The reason that it says purple is that it was difficult and costly to get clothing dyed with purple. It required quite the process in order to achieve it. So most clothes ended up being sort of a dingy, grayish, brownish color, unless you had money to pay for some sort of fine clothing. I don't know about you, but I have some interestingly fine clothing. Maybe not the most expensive clothing in the world, but I've got a bunch of my own. He had plenty to eat, it said. More than enough. In those days, it would have been fortunate if you would have had meat to eat once a week. But this guy seems to feast on meat every night. So he's living kind of in the lap of luxury. By those standards, You and I are doing pretty well. How many of you have clothes in your closet you haven't worn for, weeks, months, years? You don't remember when. We have more than enough. How many of you have missed a meal recently? How many of you have the opportunity to eat meat every day, every meal? Most of us, the problem isn't that we don't get enough meat or we don't get enough food. The problem is that we eat too much. And that seems to be the issue of our lives and a part of the issue of our healthcare system. We feast sumptuously every day. We own cars and television sets and stereos. Some of us have television sets in almost every room of our house. I'm not sure about bathrooms. I haven't checked all of your bathrooms yet, but there might be. We have computers. Some of you are holding a computer more powerful than that took people to the moon in the 1960s, right there in your pocket right now. This winter, when our homes get cold, yes, it does get cold here in California if you're visiting, we won't spend time scavenging for food and worrying about how we'll keep warm. We'll just turn a little knob in the thermostat, and it'll get warmer. Few people in the world live by the standard which you and I live today. We dress in fine clothing. We feast sumptuously every day, so much so that we have to figure out how to curtail our feasting. My point is this: if the rich man's sin is only that he's rich, we are in deep trouble. We are among the most comfortable people on the planet, perhaps among the most comfortable people in all of human history. If being rich condemns us, we're condemned. But the rich man's sin was not being rich. The rich man's sin was that he never noticed Lazarus. The rich man's sin was that he could tolerate great suffering at his own doorstep without feeling compassion, as the sin was condemned by Amos in our first lesson for today. How you could see the ruin of Joseph, in other words, the nation to their north, their brothers, also Israelites, and they could not be concerned at all. But if the rich man's sin was not seeing and caring about the suffering of his neighbor, are we not also in danger too? Who is the Lazarus in our lives? For those of you taking notes, that's the theme statement. Who is the Lazarus in your lives? Who is the Lazarus in your life? Maybe it's an elderly widow who lives next door to you, or maybe sits down the row from you in church, who just needs a little compassion and companionship. Maybe it's that person who would enjoy a friendly word or an invitation from dinner, but who lives more often in her life with solitude. Maybe it's that person who you work with and who's going through a divorce, feeling terrible, knows that they need to be out, but feeling more and more by their depression withdrawn. They're not much fun to be around, and so they spend more and more time alone. Who is your Lazarus? Our Lazarus might be homeless people. How many of you know homeless people? How many of you know their names? Maybe it's people on the street. Maybe you've made up a name for them because it's so easy to overlook them and so easy not to have a conversation. It's easier to make up a moniker than to actually know their name. Or an abused woman or a child or a dad who only gets to see his kids every other weekend, or a teen estranged from their parents, or a kid who always seems to be doing their own thing, and we chalk it up to that instead of seeing their great loneliness. Our Lazarus might be prisoners in a local jail. I've gone to the local jail. It's not a fun place. I know some folks say that it's a lap of luxury and just a lot of doing nothing, but that's not a place where I'd want to be. I certainly don't believe that we ought to open up the jails and let everybody out, but it also needs to be a place where we see a Lazarus and care for them and serve them. The point of Jesus' parable is simply that there are people like Lazarus in our community, in our neighborhood. There are people like Lazarus in our congregation, and we need to take them seriously. My 3 points, you ready? We are to see them. We are to help them. And we're called to serve them. That's for confirmands, by the way, why I'm slowing down, giving theme statements and points. There's my 3 points. While I was preparing the sermon, I came across some stories by Albert Schweitzer, of course, famous person that I believe is right on point. Allow me to share at least a couple of them. Schweitzer, as you might remember, was a wonderfully talented man who lived first in Germany and then in France. He was a concert organist. That's what he was well known for. He was also a theologian. He had a wonderful life. He was a Christian, a leader, a deacon in his church, a man of serious faith. So Schweitzer felt called to pursue a degree in medicine so that he could spread the gospel and along with that gospel use God's healing arts to care for those who didn't have enough medical care. Although he was a theologian, he felt called to be a healer instead of called to be a preacher. And he wanted to allow his good works to point people towards Christ, the Christ that had inspired him. So he was called to West Africa and started serving in a jungle hospital, established a hospital there. He spent the rest of his life in that place, serving as a physician of the great physician, caring for the Lazarus of Europe's doorstep. He died there at the age of 90, was buried in a simple grave near the hospital that he had founded. His grave is marked with a simple cross that he made for himself. The hospital that he founded is still there, still providing care to tens of thousands of Africans. Do you know what inspired Schweitzer to leave Europe and go to Africa? One day he was reading in the Gospel according to St. Luke, and he came across a couple of troubling parables, one of which is our parable for today, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. This parable was the spark that moved his life. He asked the question, who are the overlooked Lazaruses in life today? If he had stayed in France, he would have enjoyed a wonderful life, a full and comfortable life. He would have made life nicer for other people by playing beautiful concert quality organs and by being a physician and healer. But because of this parable, Schweitzer became a towering inspiration to generations after him. If he'd have stayed in Europe, I wonder if we would know anything about a man named Albert Schweitzer. But because he heard the call of Christ to see and to care and to serve the Lazarus in the world, we know him. And his name has been etched forever as the great heroes of faith and servants of humanity, because he could see the needs of Lazarus. He could care for the Lazarus, and he understood the call of Christ to serve them. His faith became a way of seeing people that other people didn't see. His faith became a way of caring for people that other people didn't care for. His faith became for him a joy that other people couldn't understand. In 1950, Schweitzer paid a visit to America. He was in Chicago. A group of prominent citizens lined the train track in the depot where he was arriving to greet him. And when Schweitzer stepped off the train, he was just surrounded by this gushing welcome, and he responded warmly. But then something caught Schweitzer's eye, and he excused himself, and he dashed off across the platform, diving into a crowd, and he stopped beside an elderly woman who was struggling with her luggage, with very large bags, heavy suitcases. With his strong hands, he grabbed the suitcases and asked her to follow him, direct him to where he was going, and he threaded his way through the crowd, and they made their way into one of the coaches, and he lifted up the suitcases and put them into the overhead racks for her, and he wished her a good journey. And then he came back to the crowds who were there standing with their mouths open, and he apologized for keeping them waiting, and then he said something sheepishly. He said, I guess I was just having my daily fun. I was just having my daily fun. Schweitzer found both fun and greatness in stooping to help others that other people couldn't see or other people would not reach out to care for. He found joy in service to others. And that's what this parable calls us as first world American, wealthy, sumptuously feasting folks to see that we have a responsibility to joy. It calls us to strip the scales from our eyes so that we might see, to strip scales from our hearts that we might care, and to strip the weights off our feet so that we might go to the Lazarus of our world. The payoff is huge. Schweitzer found joy in it. Not only will we help other people, but we'll discover a quality in our lives that perhaps defies understanding or comprehension. We'll find a joy and a peace that comes from another source. We'll find fullness where once was emptiness. We'll find beautiful colors where once there was only gray. I have one more story of Schweitzer. Some of us remember Marion Preminger. She was the wife of the famous film director Otto Preminger. Marion was born in Hungary in 1913. She was raised in a palace surrounded by servants, maids, and tutors, and butlers and chauffeurs. Her parents sent her to school in Vienna, where she met a handsome doctor, and they married. But the marriage only lasted a year. So she looked for a job as an actress, and that's how she met Otto, the brilliant young director. They fell in love. They got married. They moved to the United States so that Otto could pursue a Hollywood career. Unfortunately, early days of Miley Cyrus, Hollywood turned out to be a poor place for a young marriage, and the young two self-absorbed people into whose clutches it fell. They got caught up in the glamour and the lights, and they fell into a sordid and an empty lifestyle. Then while visiting Europe, Marion encountered Schweitzer. While she was visiting there, she went to an organ concert in a small village church, and the Schweitzers were there. They met each other, and the Schweitzers invited her to go to dinner with them. As a result, Marion ended up going back to Africa with the Schweitzers, to the hospitals in West Africa where they served, where she changed bandages and bathed babies and fed lepers. And in the process, she would report, found a happiness that had always eluded her. Jesus blessed her seeing of Lazarus at her doorstep, her caring, and for taking the time to serve with an elusive form of joy that we can't find at the mall. Did you notice anything in common between the story of Albert Schweitzer and Marion Preminger? It wasn't that she and he were obligated to do works. It's that when she was presented with an alternative way of being, with an alternative way of living her life, led by faith, it's then that she found a joy that she had always searched for. It was then that he found a joy that he'd always looked for. This parable is just a story that Jesus tells. I know we get all caught up in trying to make great systematic theology out of all of Jesus' stories. But the fact is that Jesus just chose an ending to the story because he's talking to scribes and Pharisees, if you're looking with me in Luke 16, with whom have an axe to grind against him. But it doesn't have to end the way Jesus ended it. This is a parable. It's not a prediction. We have the law, just like they did. We have Moses and the prophets, just like they did. And one who cared for the poor, who was put to death, who also rose from the dead. We also have that one. And so we have plenty of witnesses. And of course, we have plenty of warning. We can make a new ending to this parable. Let me close with a question, the theme question I put to you before, to think about this week, to pray about this week, to ask God for guidance in it this week. The question is this: who is the Lazarus at your doorstep? Can you see them? If you can see them, you can care for them. And if you can see and care for them, you can serve the one who holds them and loves them as if they are in his bosom. May we hear these parables as the word of judgment that they're meant to be, but as also gospel good news, that there is another way to end this story, and there is another way to find joy. May we find it when we see and care and serve Christ in Lazarus, who's always at the door. Amen. Folks, let's sing together. We'll get our worship team.